So the theme for today is women, gender, and sexuality. Of course, this is an enormous topic, and I just want it to be clear that this is not just about women artists, although women artists factor in very importantly, but it is also about gender constructions and about identities and stereotypes of gender, which includes men, and men performing stereotypes of gender that are associated with women. So it doesn't exclude male artists or male subjectivity. And then lastly, because gender and sexuality are often very much connected, and we saw in the lecture that I gave and some of the previous classes that we've had, that sexuality is something that's very central to Japanese artistic production, the expression of sexuality, but the ideas of how to question normative sexuality. So I thought this would be a nice kind of coupling of these three concepts together. So we will start off with some very important women artists and then get to some of the larger thematics of gender and sexuality, and those are also embedded in their work. And I really think in the last few years, the artist Yoko Ono, who of course is known for her celebrity and her marriage to John Lennon and purported breaking up of the Beatles, whether that was mythic or not, she really has been reassessed in terms of her importance in her own career and her relationship to the global movement of Fluxus, which was a performance-based, object-based type of global art movement that was very active in the 60s and 70s, and Yoko Ono was a formative member of that group, and there were a lot of Japanese artists who flowed in and out of Fluxus. Fluxus was a very fluid movement, but she also worked with High Red Center. She worked with some of the really central performance art groups, and there was a major retrospective of her work that was traveling around. It was in Japan, and then it was in New York at the Japan Society. So her work has really been reassessed. Just pick a few samples to give you a sense. We talked about the centrality of performance art. Well, one of her classic pieces is the cut piece, and these are works that have descriptions. They're conceptual, and then they are enacted, and people enact upon her, and that makes it somewhat random how it comes out. I'm not sure if you're all familiar with what this piece involved, but basically she sat on stage, she put a scissor in front of herself, and she invited the audience to come up and cut pieces of her clothing off. And every venue where she went, the engagement was different. Some of it much more timid and much more respectful. Other places where people literally hacked her off her clothes until she was naked. And she remained entirely impassive during the entire endeavor. So this idea of the woman as the object that is acted upon is very important for this kind of idea of the core theme of this piece. And using her body as a central means of artistic expression, we find that a lot of women artists, we saw Kusama Yayoi also doing these painted bodies. The body becomes so central. You can't separate the body from gender and from sexuality, because as her clothes are cut off, she's literally made naked, and her body is revealed, and so the proprieties of private and public bodily expression are really questioned here. We also have, so you have people, the audience is a participant in this. It has to be collaborative. This piece does not exist without some audience response, some audience participation. And by engaging the audience, they're implicated in the violent act of cutting off her clothing. They can either act or not act. How they decide to act is about their own sense of relationship. And you can see these are various, I mean, this is the description, this is the work, cut piece, cut, that's it, that's the work as it is described. And you might see this piece and some of the documentary descriptions of it and the aftermaths of it on the wall, but literally she has all different kinds of conceptual art pieces that are performance, where she just has a description of what you're supposed to do, and then it can be enacted. Light a match, let it burn till it burns out. Those kinds of things. So you can see that there's every time it's enacted, it's different. It's ephemeral. It's over when it's done. And we talked about this period of anti-materialism, about how performance art comes out of a context of trying to dematerialize art or to put a focus on the commodification of art in this new economy of global capital. You can also see this as part of a larger symposium that was called Destruction in Art, a kind of iconoclasm, because one of the great icons of Western art and art in general is the nude, and the idea of the nude, of the nude body is beautiful. But what does it mean when you take it one step back and the nude is created through a violent act of ripping off her clothes, of literally cutting her clothes off as she stands there, as she sits there impassively. So looking at this kind of work, what kind of issues do you think, what other kinds of issues do you think this brings up? Of course, it wasn't just men cutting off clothes, women came up as well.
Well, depending on where it was performed, there's also an issue of race,
yes,
ethnicity, of course gender. But I mean, obviously these are Americans,
right? Or Europeans. It was enacted in London, and so there's the kind of racial, ethnic aspects of it. She's an Asian woman. We talked about how the demureness of the Asian woman was one of the stereotypes of identity. And so, what does this say that she reenacts that? Yes, Charlotte?
Did she always have the same clothes on, or the same style of clothing? So would that be part of her initial performance?
She didn't always have the same clothes on. She often had just a regular dress, and then she would have a bra and underwear and undergarments of some kind, sometimes a slip. So she wore different clothes, but it was usually a dress or something, feminine, but very neutral. It had a rather neutral. It certainly wasn't low cut or anything like that.
And not Japanese.
Not Japanese. No, a Western style dress. She wasn't wearing kimono. If that's yes.
But she also performed it in Japan.
Yes.
And do you know anything about the difference in
well,
reaction?
There is actually a study of the different responses, and I believe, I'm trying to remember, there was one that was particularly the most violent in the context of where people really got into it and really started to want to hack off parts of her clothes. And in fact, they started to brandish the scissors in their own kind of performative way, which was quite frightening for her, that they almost got into it too much. And I'm trying to remember whether that was London or, I don't have the specific dates when she did it and when, but there were very different audiences. Some audiences were much more discreet and much more tentative, and others became much rowdier and much more into it. And so the audience context is extremely important. Yes, I think it was at the London Symposium where the audience, this Destruction in Art, part of the Symposium of Destruction in Art, where they cut off all her clothes till she was completely naked. Most of the audiences left her with her undergarments on, or they would cut a strap so it would come down, which brings up one of the main themes, of course, of sexual assault. And the idea of, the tattered, the ripped bra, more than even the naked body, because the naked body is kind of intact. But when you see clothing that's been violently ripped off, you have that. It returns to this idea of victimization, of sexual assault, of even visually disrobing women and the kind of stalker victimization that you have, or even exhibitionism. And now that we're in an age of webcams, where people watch other people disrobe and do these kinds of things, this is, I think, a beginning part of thinking about what that voyeurism is, because it's not just the people doing the act, it's the people watching it and allowing it to happen. Because if they were so disturbed by it, they would stop it or they would do something. So everyone is a participant. Even watching is an action. Viewing is an action. And you are getting a scopic kind of desire from that, a kind of sexual titillation from doing that. We also touched on some of the issues of, yes, sorry.
Do you know if she was in reviews constructed as being particularly Japanese? Because I always thought of Yoko Ono more like an American. But here in a performance piece, you see her ethnicity on the stage. So I wonder if she was always reattached to being the Japanese artist, even though in her, I don't know, connections to the art world, she's much more American, and to me, she's totally American.
Well, that's a good question, and I think there was a perception definitely of her as distinctly Japanese, but Fluxus itself was quite multi-ethnic and multiracial, so that itself I don't think would have been so distinctive, but with her alone here, I think it definitely did stand out. I think you're absolutely right. And even in some of the characterizations of her vis-a-vis John Lennon, her Japaneseness, and whether she's typically Japanese or not typically Japanese also comes to be discussed. So that's also another issue. Well, there's no doubt that when we're talking about this act of perhaps a mob mentality or the psychology of participating in this, this is the era of doing these psychological studies on mob mentality, what people will do and if they are told to do something, when they will stop. For instance, pressing buttons to give what they think is pain to a subject that they either can hear or see, and that they will do it until the person literally passes out when they are told to. So the idea of when you are told to do something about authority, what authority does to personal will, and how, and coming in the wake of the World War II, when the idea of personal complicity is so important, what will people do, particularly when they see others doing it? So this idea, well, he's doing it, and someone told me to do it, so I guess it's okay to do it, even in these contexts. Well, when would you say, no, even if I see people doing it, this isn't right? And so that idea of personal responsibility, at the end of those types of psychological experiments, they always have to debrief the subjects, because it is really a traumatic type of experience to inflict pain on people and to think it's okay. And so they have to, that's part of the ethics of giving those kinds of tests. But that idea of the personal will, collectivized behavior, and violence, enacting violence on other people. And we also talked about normative sexuality, whether it includes sadism and masochism, because there are spheres of sexuality that do focus on and do get pleasure out of sadistic and masochistic types of activities, and this puts the audience in that role. They put them in the role of the sadist, making someone suffer. And they also render the artist into a masochist, in a sense, being the person who's having something perpetrated upon them. She reenacted this. She's done this performance many times, and of course it can be reenacted. She did it again in 2002. She had this major traveling retrospective, and so she redid this. And what it means to do it as a woman who's much older, I think, is also a really interesting issue about victimhood. But also she did it again as part of an initiative for world peace in the context of a post 9/11 world. And just to remind you that a lot of the work of John Lennon and their work together as a couple was in the context of anti-Vietnam War activism. For instance, when they got married, they turned their marital bed, their nuptial bed, into a bed of peace. And they used the private chambers of their bed, waking up, here they are, with all of the paparazzi around them, coming in to photograph them sleeping in their bed, to agitate for peace. So they are already understanding the powers of celebrity, the power of this kind of mass media attention, and using it to redirect it towards political activism, or even something like these large billboards, which is what regular advertisers would use, and war is over, trying to agitate for peace through those kinds of mediums and all. So the idea of the be in, the sit in, well, this is the bed in, these are those kinds of very public, but also very engaged interventionist political statements. So the bed in for peace. And what's important about that is also remembering that private action impacts on public action. Public public and political action. So even the most private, even the personal is political. And this is the age of thinking about what you do, what you buy is a political action. Now people really think about that. They really think about, I'm going to buy organic, I'm going to buy green. Of course, corporations adapt to that, and they make green one of their branding issues. So you can buy bio, organic things, you can buy green products. You never get outside the market. But the fact is that understanding private behavior as a public action and political action is really important. Another acquaintance of Yoko Ono, and who also was very active and went to New York and was part of the international art scene, the Fluxus movement in 1963, was Kubota Shigeko. She subsequently met the very influential Korean-born artist Namjoon Paik, who became probably one of the premier video artists of the 20th century, and they got married. And one of her classic pieces is this a performance that she did called the Vagina Painting, which was done at a Fluxus festival in 1965. Now, whether she's actually painting with her private parts or not is really not the central issue. What is important is that she has a paintbrush literally attached to her underwear, and she's painting through her sexual organs, and she is painting this red paint around. So the evocation of menstrual blood, of this idea of the penetration of the instrument as women are subjects, but now she's turned the body into a mode of expression where it can literally produce the paintings through its own orifices almost. Now, women's sexual organs, their private parts, their vagina, your ovaries, those are connected with fertility, with the ideas of women as fertile, as fecund, and so she's taking those organs and taking them, making another kind of fertility, another kind of production. But this idea saying that these can be production, they can be creative and fertile for women artists, rather than objectified for male pleasure. And this kind of work, and so what she did was she basically just squatted around and painted. And this should evoke images of the types of work that we looked at for Kazuo, Shiraga Kazuo, and other types of action painting where the body is being used. But it's very distinctive that she is not using her feet or other parts of her body, because there's a whole range of artists during this time who are painting with parts of their body or using other people's bodies, like Yves Klein, to paint and rolling women's bodies. So when you think of this work in the context of those body paintings, how different that is, how different the choice of the spot, of the location of the mode of creativity is, that really sets it off and shows the kind of critique that she's doing. Originally when I teach this class, I show a video that she made called My Father, and we have it at Duke, but it wasn't available online. But I'd like to describe it a little bit, because like Namjoon Paik, she is a very prolific video artist. And if you can find it, it's only a 15-minute video. It's called My Father, from 1973 to 75. And it is literally about her sitting in the living room of her home back in Japan, watching her father die of cancer. And it's very melancholic, and most of the time you can't even really hear what they're talking about. They're having a rather mundane conversation. She and her father, he's lying in bed, he's wrapped up, she's at the table, and they're in the background is the television going constantly, showing the top 10, the pop enka singers who are singing this kind of, enka is kind of like the country and western, the country western music of Japan. It's usually very melancholy. It's usually about love and loss and tears. So you have these singers in the background crooning as they're having basically what is a final parting, a farewell, a very extended farewell. And that idea of the banality of everyday life, thinking about what a life means, and the very personal relationship between a father and a daughter who's gone off to be abroad and has come back really to send her father off. It's extremely poignant. And after her father has died, so it goes over the extended stay of his illness, she just sits at the end and she just weeps. And it's just endless video of her weeping, saying, you know, my father. And that idea of this cathartic grief and exorcism of grief and feeling, it's so deeply personal. And which is really different from, different from the kind of work, say, that Nam June Paik does in video. And so video artists doing very different kinds of things and very personal elements. And I will, at the end, show you an artist, Ichiuchi Miyako, who I mentioned briefly in my talk on Monday, who also is very personal, and one of her mementos is to her mother and to the objects of her mother. So I see a continuity here about that women are often defined by their connections to family, their connections to children, but here not children, but as the daughter who's responsible for filial piety to her own father. So very, very powerful, yet banal work in its own kind of setting. It's really just that room and that emotion that comes through. This is an artist, Shimada Yoshiko, who has been extremely controversial in Japan, to the point where she has even received death threats. She is probably one of the few artists who really takes the label of feminist activist, and applies it to her work and herself. And now artists are very leery about calling themselves feminist. It almost seems passé and old-fashioned to be feminist, but she sees herself in this role as an activist feminist, and she uses it to make very critical, powerful works, critical not only of the state, but of women themselves. So rather than always lauding women as somehow victims, or somehow always, if women were in charge, everything would be okay, and you know, that kind of idea, she's really saying, well, women did have roles in these types of things, particularly the perpetration of total war, and they were active in enslaving other women, that there were hierarchies among women, and not all women suffered the same. Putting those issues at the forefront has been part of what she's done. She did this very famous portrait. It's called A Picture to Be Burned. It's an etching with a colored etching here, and of course it is a direct reference to the portraits of the Showa Emperor Hirohito. This is a photograph, a rondo portrait of the emperor back in the 1930s. Shimada grew up in Tachikawa, very close to a U.S. military base, so she was keenly aware of the militarization of Japan, the impact of the loss of the war, and the occupation. So she's really thinking about, as was Ichiuchi as well. She grew up in Yokosuka, and so being right on the periphery of the remnants of the occupation puts you right in this liminal world of what is often very exploitative. I mean, there's often a lot of base prostitution and a lot of things that are going on. Also, it brings to the fore American hegemony and the fact that you have an occupying force there. So she's very aware of the war, the shadow of the war, and the inability of the Japanese to really deal with war responsibility through education. That there's no discussion in textbooks, which has been a big controversy, about war responsibility. So by creating a picture where the face is blotted out, saying this is an iconoclastic image, let's burn the image of the emperor, knowing it full well that everyone would automatically know this image of Hirohito or any other image of the emperor, is a way, it really shocked the media and became this kind of media scandal, and she received death threats from right-wing nationalist groups, and eventually she had to leave. She came to Germany for 3 years and then stayed for several years and then finally went back. But it was, she and several artists received this when they tried to critique and try to bring to the fore issues of war responsibility when they explicitly used things related to the emperor. Because there are certain groups, nationalist groups in Japan, that still believe the divinity of the imperial household. So it's right at the death of the Showa emperor died in 1989. So it was right at that moment that there should have been an opportunity to discuss what the Showa period meant, what the emperors, even though he had been rehabilitated into this kindly old biologist and he was this nice little old man, you still have the shadow of the war and needing to really just have public debates on that. The other issues that she's been addressing are women's complicity through mobilized women's group, the Aikoku Fujinkai and other groups where women wore these white robes and they wore banners showing their allegiance to the state, and they also did weapons training. And they were prepared for a land assault by the Allies if they had to. So this idea that Japanese women were on the home front and they were not militarized. Well, the home front was militarized too, and they were actively culpable in doing this. And this kind of gets at some of the issues that have been coming up in studies of particularly German wartime responsibility, with this idea of being a willing accomplice. Are you a willing or unwilling accomplice? And so much of the post-war Japanese discourse on war responsibility says, we were duped. The military lied to us. We were duped. We didn't know anything about this. We were lied to and brainwashed, and we had no idea. We didn't know any better. But yet, when you look at the degree of participation, what people got out of it, that they, in many ways, some of the feminist scholars like Wakakuwa Midori, for instance, who's written a lot on this, have shown how women became empowered within the system of the state. Because before that, their social status was low, but within these women's groups, they had a lot of responsibility to carry forward the vision of mobilization. So she's really confronting that. She's confronting the myth of their demilitarization, that they were just on the home front, didn't know, were duped. And also, so you see these are etchings superimposed, and she does these multimedia pieces that are very evocative, but using this kind of sepia tint to show that it's historical. What does historical record really mean? What is visible evidence? And trying to show that it's all about this subjectivity, the subjectivity of how people see these kinds of things. And this is constantly in the news because Asian countries are constantly asking for apologies. Every time Nakasone or one of the prime ministers tries to go to Yasukuni Shrine to pray for the war dead, the sacred war dead, everybody, all of the other parts of Asia scream, Japan has not ever taken responsibility, where is the apology for wartime atrocities? So it's constantly an open wound in a sense. So Shimada writes, she has a statement called, and this is on the web so you can download it, Art, Activism, Feminism, and Myself. I dare say that I am a feminist and art activist. I know it is not fashionable to say this. It seems that the prevailing image of feminist or political art is that it involves stating the obvious. And so she's really interested in that there's still meaning in this kind of activism. And when others have kind of said, well, we need to move beyond that, the kind of stereotypes of feminism. For me, art is a tool of self-examination and communication in order to know who I am, an Asian, a Japanese, a woman, examining the recent past history of Japan and the role of women and what we have done to the people of Asia is unavoidable. So she's taking responsibility herself, too. It's not just about pointing figures, but the idea about complicitous social relations. One of the biggest issues, of course, is the forever festering question of the comfort women. And even the term comfort women is a euphemism. Really, it was sex slavery. Women throughout the colonies, primarily Korean women, although Japanese women as well, were forced into prostitution to serve the imperial army. And they have never received any compensation for it until recently. And so they have been active lobbying groups. And as you can see, they're getting older and older. So there are these little old Korean women who are just standing up there saying, you have to recognize the sexual slavery as that we were forced into doing this as laborers, as indentured slaves, and we want to be compensated for that. And so she did this work called Comfort Women, Yanfu, which is the Japanese euphemism for it, and I think it in a sense covers over the violence of it, because they were offering comfort to the soldiers. That makes it sound like they were giving them care packages. But comfort women, or women of conformity, and you see the eye, the memory of, and of course the text over her mouth because she's been silenced, so the idea of being able to speak. And then these women in the patriotic associations in the home front who facilitated the exploitation of colonial women, or at least did not speak out against it, and also women of lower classes within Japan themselves, because plenty of farm girls were sent to Borneo and other places, or showing some of the houses of prostitution and the women who were. So this superimposition of images and texts on give this layering of history and of the archive. One of her most, and she's really interested in giving voice to voiceless victims and nailed this idea of that Japanese women were entirely victims in this male-dominated notion of militarism. One of the modes that she works most effectively in is in the installation, multimedia installations, and this is one called Look at Me, Look at You. And then on the right is one called Tied to Apron Strings. And she uses the apron, these clothing, which is not only associated with domesticity, which is the sphere of women, the appropriate sphere of women, but also the uniform of women on the home front. Because every time we see the patriotic women's associations, we see them wearing these aprons, and they have their banners on identifying them as part of this group. So it is, in a sense, a kind of uniform. It's not just a mere apron. So in this work, there's actually sound, and what you see is a wedding dress, a kind of typical Western-style wedding dress, the bride, and she's cloaked with her domestic apron, and she's looking at an image where she sees part of herself, but part of another gown behind, which is a traditional Korean outfit in white, and which has a kimono being put over it, because part of what the Japanese colonial imperial policy was called kominka, which meant imperialization. They wanted to transform the church intervenes, transform their colonial subjects into Japanese citizens or Japanese subjects, and they did that through making them learn the language. They did that through wearing kimono. And so that kind of cloaking of the colonial subject in a kimono, but here revealing the Korean identity underneath, and you see the woman here looking at her own identity, looking at her own counterpart in Korea, but yet not sympathetic because she's only seeing her own reflection, most of her own reflection. So the idea that these were sacred mothers, that they were not sympathetic to how the Korean women were used, or how their identity was suppressed. And that idea also, she's playing on a traditional dichotomy between the idea of the woman as Madonna and the woman as whore, the woman as the sacred mother and the woman as sex slave. So here you have these two opposing camps looking at each other. There's also an auditory component to this installation on the left, where you hear someone knocking on the door, and then the word says hayaku, hayaku, which means quickly, go quickly. And this has a kind of double meaning for these, for this particular theme. One, it was referring to the impatience of the Japanese soldiers, who would often come in one after another to see these prostitutes, the comfort women. So they would say, hurry up, people are waiting. Go quickly, that impatience. And it's a very visceral, violent kind of, but it's very subtle. It's just, you just hear the knocking. But also to the idea of hurry up and deal with this issue. Address the comfort women issue. Hayaku, in the sense of this needs to be addressed quickly. This is something that's really important, that to the government saying, compensate these women for their suffering. So the hayaku has this double valence to it. Here you have image where you have these hanging aprons from the ceiling, and they have these draped red ribbons from the bottom, and the ribbons are tethered to guns. So if you remember, and this might be shown in conjunction with some of those etching images of old photographs, archival photographs of women doing pistol practice. And of course women also did bamboo spear practice. They did all kinds of martial activities. So that idea of, well, even tethered to the apron, to the domestic apron, is an instrument of violence. And of course it's like flowing blood, that idea of flowing blood out. So getting at their own complicity with this. So even the domestic sphere, the sphere of women's identity in this period, where women were empowered to be managers, good wives, wise mothers, even that sphere is complicit in the larger system, and it cannot be seen as innocent or separate from that sphere of political activity. And now we shift spheres entirely to an artist photographer, Morimura Yasumasa, who in a very different way, but equally political and very much embedded in the discourses and canonicity of art history, interrogates identity, Japanese identity, national identity, gender identity, and what the simulation of things is in the mass media. So what constitutes the real, or the evaporation of the real in a world of simulation. So Morimura, as you can see here, some of his earliest, most striking works that really got him a lot of attention in critical writing, what he would do is he would take a famous portrait or famous work of art, like Van Gogh's self-portrait with bandaged ear and pipe, one of the iconic symbols of artistic angst and suffering. The self-portrait, of course, is the genre of subjectivity, but here even more so because Van Gogh is known for cutting off his ear because of his own suffering. He's a symbol of tragic bohemian angst. And then Morimura inserts his own face in this work, smoking the pipe with the same image. And yet it's a photograph which has a painterly aesthetic to it. It looks like a painting, and some of the ambiguity between the photography and the painting is very important for the kind of work that he does. He has this surface varnish that simulates the appearance of painting. Because as we know, painting is an auratic art, is a singular art, whereas photography, as associated with the reproduction, is a mass media form, is a form of mass media and reproduction. So what does it mean to kind of blur those boundaries? So why would Morimura, a Japanese artist, he's from Osaka, actively engaged in the Japanese context, why use Van Gogh as a touchstone for his own examination of the role of art or the role of the artist? Why not pick something Japanese? What might that symbolism be, or the evocation? Begona, what do you think?
I don't know, maybe for him, the artist.
Say it a little louder, sorry. With the projector, it's hard to hear.
Maybe for him, the feelings are equal everywhere, so he doesn't need to pick specifically a Japanese painting. He could reflect himself in a foreign painting also.
Yeah. I think by the 1980s, Van Gogh was equally part of the canon of every artist studying throughout the world. There's a globalization of art canons. And the idea is that he is also participating in this, not just that the history of art is not just the Japanese history of art, but it's a world history of art. And if anything, it's the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists who are so important for the Japanese and even Chinese development of modernism and postmodernism. So if anything, he feels closer and more allied to a Van Gogh and some of these works. So that idea that your history, your past, is only that of your nation state is just bankrupt. And so he's really pointing at, this is the art history that I am steeped in. This is what I want to insert myself in. I see myself as part of this. this element. He's also part of, art becomes theatrical, it becomes performative. He's performing the canon, and he's not only performing the suffering artist, but he's performing the great works of art. And that idea of how pop culture reproduces these works to the extent that we all feel like we can have them. We all feel like we're inserted into them in some way. So he stages these, and he has a whole series of them, the Daughters of Art History series, where you see him here. He's chosen, of course, this figure from the famous work by Velázquez, Las Meninas, which itself is freighted with so much in terms of critical theory. This appeared on one of Foucault's books, and it is one of the touchstones and important works of kind of getting at post-structuralist notions of deconstructing the gaze, because you have so many people gazing here, and she's gazing outward. And there have been many analyses of Las Meninas, particularly the famous one by Foucault, talking about the power of the gaze and these ideas of the power of the hegemonic gaze. And so, but here you see, what does it mean to have a Japanese man inserting himself into the body of the infanta, the princess, the Spanish princess here? Of course, you see Velázquez painting, so the painter has already inserted himself in the painting. So it's not so strange that Morimura is inserting himself as well, because he's mirroring the activity that Velázquez has already brought to the fore, the idea of the artist as part of the image production. But that idea of a constant refraction of vision and gaze, of all of the gazes here, including her parents here looking, through, they are probably here being reflected in the mirror in the background. And there's some really wonderful other later riffs on this theme. This work has become really a centerpiece of thinking about deconstructing the gaze here. And of course, it's very campy as well. There's a really strong humorous element to these types of works, which is making fun of high art, making fun of the serious in a kind of self-referential critique, pastiching things together. Actually, this work, Portrait Nine Faces, which is a very famous, this is a Rembrandt painting from 1632, Anatomy Lesson of Dr. Nicholas Tulp. This was actually at Art Basel. They had this work at Art Basel, and it's really quite a spectacular work, I have to say. It really gives. It really does.
So it's on sale?
It was on sale, yes. I didn't have the guts to ask how much it was going to cost, but yes, yeah. And it's quite large. It's actually as large as the Sweden projection, so it's a very big painting, photograph. But it does have, you can really see when you get up close to it, you can see that varnish creating that sense of an impasto on the paint. So you take the gold-framed masterpiece of Rembrandt, and then here you have Morimura not only just once inserting himself, but the replication of his own face in every single piece, including the patient himself. That idea of endless simulation, that idea that it's possible now. I mentioned about the curatoriate, that you don't even need the curator, you can even have a simulation of a curator. The idea of the simulation of people, and that they can be multiple places, they can be reinserted in, kind of questions what the base of the real is. Where is the real in this world? And the computerized imagery can constantly change anything. They can erase people, they can put people in. It also questions art's fundamental identity as a mode of individual originality. Because one, he didn't create the concept for this work. It's a pastiche or a parody of another work. But also the fact is that he hasn't even hand reproduced himself. So that kind of the artist's hand as something that's critical to genius and masterpieces is erased in Morimoto's work. It's the concept that's really important. The concept, the idea of appropriating images for one's own purposes. There's an added level of resonance for the context of Japan for this work because of the very important aspect of Dutch medicine and Dutch learning in Japan, Rangaku. And so this kind of gets at the special history, the special relationship that Rangaku had as the only conduit, primarily during the Edo period, for scientific understanding from the outside world. So the Dutch learning was tremendously, tremendously important. Of course, other than the stuff that came from China, which was also significant. But this idea of Rangaku, Dutch learning, and one of the first textbooks on anatomy was a Dutch text that came, the Kaitai Shinsho, translated as Kaitai Shinsho, so over 200 years ago. So this connection between Dutch learning, anatomy, understanding the body here, gives this another level of historical commentary. And the works go on, and they're endlessly creative and have been reproduced and continue to be very important. He continues to work on this kind of theme, whether it's the Folie Bergère, the daughter of art history, riffing on Manet, or Cézanne, where every face in the apples. You have all these kinds of transformations, but here, like the Infanta of the Meninas, he has a gender transposition. And that gender transposition here, he actually covers up his own genitalia, and his kind of very feminized body becomes an issue about gender stereotypes, about masculinity and femininity, and how one plays those kinds of roles. And how one plays cultural roles, racial roles. So he's transposing himself. He's transposing himself into a white woman. Which he also does with Manet's Olympia. And Manet's Olympia already has implicitly some very problematic issues of race relations, because you have the white Olympia, you have the white courtesan, and she has a black servant who's serving her. So you have built into that image the colonial other of the Francophone world, which would not have been so problematic for Manet. But here you have Morimoto playing both. So he is both the odalisque and he is the servant as well. And he's doing blackface here as a kind of biting critique, and really trying to play with the ways that you can put on other types of identities. And one of his great series is his Marilyn series. And in terms of celebrity icons, there's probably no more well-known face than Marilyn Monroe in terms of her icon as a celebrity pinup. And so he takes her first set of images, this red Marilyn, where she did naked pinups. And then the later ones from the 7-Year Itch, where her dress blows up, and then he does a black Marilyn. So there's red Marilyn, white Marilyn, and black Marilyn, and finally in black Marilyn, the dress blows up and reveals a prosthetic phallus underneath. So the idea of not only of cross-dressing, but transvestism, and that idea of deception and representation. And we saw Hijikata Tatsumi doing this as well. The bride revealed to have that golden phallus. And there's no doubt that Morimoto is playing on some archetypal celebrity images, people like Andy Warhol, who was already showing that Marilyn was not Marilyn the person. She's not Norma Jean Baker. She's not the person. She is the representation. She is the silk-screened, flattened image of her representation. And then you have this image, which is contemporary, it's playing on in 1970, which is a silk screen of Marilyn Monroe by Yoko Tadanori, who was a pop artist, very, very successful, still working. And so those works are coming in a genealogy of thinking about pop icons. And this Marilyn some of the images were actually from an advertisement in Playboy the Japanese version of Playboy magazine. So she's not just a pop icon, but she's a sex symbol, a sex goddess. And so that idea of sexuality. And there's no doubt that by the time that Morimoto's working, she's a tragic heroine too, because of her tragic death. So that kind of fakeness, the fake idea of identity and how celebrity destroys people is also part of what he's getting at. So that brings us to the image of death. And I described this in the seminar yesterday, but I think a picture's worth 1,000 words. This is that same artist who was featured in the Venice Biennale in the Ishibashi Pavilion at the Giardini last year. That was Yanagi Miwa, and this is called the Elevator Girl series. And I think I had the white casket, but oh no, here. Okay, so no, this is the white casket, and then there's the Elevator Girl series is next. So she's already making a reference to the elevator as a tomb, as a casket, as a sarcophagus, as a coffin. And this idea, elevator girl, being an elevator girl is a very desirable profession for a lot of women. They want to be because they get to wear these nice outfits and they get to direct people and they have the nice gloves and various things. But in point of fact, it's a temporary job. It's not a career. They really don't do anything except direct people up and down in very high voices. And eventually they're just basically they disintegrate into this pool of blood. And so you see these are large chromogenetic photographs. So they're large color photographs that she stages. She stages models doing this. So this isn't her. She's photographing models doing this. And then they themselves just start to disintegrate into a pool of blood. And then the pool of blood dwindles into these little globules. And here you have her name written there in the stylized script of the brand of Mitsukoshi. And anybody who buys anything at Mitsukoshi gets their goods wrapped in that paper. So you would know that pattern. So this liquid, this idea of women sacrificing themselves for the organization within modern corporate America. And this gets to the whole culture of office ladies, OLs, who really hit a glass ceiling, and they're encouraged once they get married, they're actually forced out. It's very, very hard to be on an executive track as a woman. Things are changing, but not nearly as quickly as you'd expect. So these are really very biting critiques of the limited professional opportunities for women and the kind of fantasy of these red uniforms. And here she has this whole series of elevator girls where they're either on escalators where they just collapse, or here they are just objectified as mannequins within the vitrines, because a lot of the subways go underneath department stores, and so as you go along you see the displays of the vitrines of the department stores there, and so now the elevator girls have become the object of viewing. This is a series I absolutely love, and I encourage you all to look at it online because it's an interactive video website that you need to click on, and it's basically if you Google Yanagi Miwa, my grandmothers, but this is about women's aspirations and imagining themselves old. So this idea of the grandmothers asking all of these different women for stories of what they would do if they were 50 years older, what their life would be, what would they do, and some of them are very liberatory, including this very interesting one under Yuka, where you click on Yuka and it says, oh, I would be in LA with my biker boyfriend, and other ones where they're out traveling or in these worlds of spas or fantasy. That kind of thinking about, commenting on the entrapment of women within their own gender stereotypes and the ways they can liberate themselves through fantasy projection. And she sees this connection between young and old women, and she did that also in the other images that she did for the Biennale. Another area where women have really come to the fore is in photography, in these new kinds of self-performative photographs that they take and post and create their own types of albums and publications about their own private lives. They in a sense, objectify themselves, and it kind of comes out of a very popular culture of purikura, of the print clubs. And these machines where you go with your friends and you take lots of stickers and photographs of yourselves, I know you have them here in Germany as well, and then you exchange them. So there's an exchange, a social exchange that goes on, and it maps out your social networks of people. And then everyone puts them in their books and their diaries, and so you have this sense of girls groups and girls friendships, and it really is this very strong new kind of playful culture that friends create for themselves. It's a social activity. And then you get a new generation of photographers like Hiromix here, who are used to snapping digital photos of each other constantly. In the world of digital photography, people are constantly taking photos of each other and posting them. So she does this of herself and her friends, and she creates this almost this kind of cultic following. And she has been supported by, of all people, Araki Nobuyoshi. He's very much a supporter of her kinds of almost diaristic photography, where she's revealing the public and somewhat titillating life of a teenage girl. She was very young when she started this. She was only 19 when she won the first prize. And she's continued to post these. Some of them are clearly pin-up style. They're very sexualized. And this does touch on some of the questions of older men who are interested in the worlds of young girls. And I think I mentioned in the Araki section this idea of compensated dating, enjo kosai, which is featured in a number of movies and has become a kind of a social issue. These are not women who are sex slaves or forced into sexual slavery, and they're not women who are doing it for financial reasons primarily. They're middle-class girls who do it to earn money for luxury goods. They do it kind of as a leisure activity, I mean, basically prostituting themselves. And so this fits into this larger context of the problematization of girls and their own sexuality. So you have this whole series, and Hiromix did a whole range of these paper doll type things. Of course, she looks a little bit like a Bond girl, from a James Bond movie. And the kinds of cameras that these photographers are using are snapshot cameras. They're point-and-shoot cameras. And like Araki, who was really championing the Polaroid and the idea of the Polaroid as a touristic, non-professional camera, of course he has professional cameras as well, which is that now photography has been deprofessionalized to a point where everybody is taking pictures of everyone else, and yet, so you can take these, everyone can participate in this sphere of representation, and that's what these images are starting to come out of. I mean, she's shooting with this kind of camera. She's not shooting with a Nikon, a really high-level camera. The other artist who is very much supported by Araki and is part of this the phenomena is called girl photography, because there's a kind of girlish cuteness that is exuded through this. And that everyone knows that kawaii, that idea of cuteness, is so important in Japanese culture. It's one of the reasons that it's picked up around the world, and girls are always known to be saying, "Oh, kawaii!" Everything is so cute. That idea of cuteness. Well, this photographer Ninagawa Mika, actually, she has an amazing website, and I highly recommend that you go. Again, Google her, Ninagawa Mika, and you can see she has. Like Araki, has used the mode of the personal monograph for her photographs. What she does, though, I don't have all of the images here, but you can see even from this image, this is called Sugar and Spice, and she photographs girls, and girls in these lush, Fujifilm saturated red and green images that are almost like the photographic equivalent of some of those pop colors that Murakami does. They're so pop, and they actually are very also akin to fashion photography that people take for On and some of the magazines. So she's straddling the world of pop fashion and girls photography and using this very eye-popping kind of high saturated colors and extremely popular. They're very sweet images, they're flirtatious, they're girlish, they're cute. So these are two kinds of artists, two kinds of photographers who've really come out and are very successful. But I just like to put this in, this series of women's photographs. Seto Masato's photographs. This is a male photographer shooting women sitting basically in the subway. It's called Silent Mode. And I think these images speak of a different kind of women's subjectivity, and it makes you understand how romanticized the kawaii world is of Minagawa or Hiromix. These are working women, they're exhausted. They look exhausted. They're not heroized in the same way. There's a kind of voicelessness. They're tired, they're bored, they're lonely, they're alienated, they're worried. And so you need to see a counterpart to this kind of glorification of girl culture. And showing them individually in these environments kind of highlights that sense of alienation. This is another part of that series here. And it's really not glamorous. So we've come, yeah, Eugene.
Was it made only in Japan, or because I see many non-Japanese women there? So, and subway looks like Japanese subway.
Right. This series is just Japanese women on the subways, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a similar kind of, if you think about some of the photographs of portraiture, and even anonymous portraiture that's done, that it picks up on this other types of trends abroad. And one could do this in the New York subway easily. There's something about coming back from work. It's not the glamorous parties, it's not that. It's like that empty train. And on the same vein of de-glorifying, making, de-heroizing, but creating a very personal vision of the body, because of course Hiromix, she has this perfect nubile body that she's presenting, but the human body, particularly as it ages and as it's scarred, takes on the impression of life, the suffering of life. And so Ishiuchi Miyako has a whole series on scars. And she says that scars, she sees skin is like a curtain over pain. And that scars are kind of, every scar has a story. So she's inviting you, when you look at these feet, these kind of, everybody knows that women wear these shoes that destroy their feet. And so this kind of, you can see the labor in the parts of the body. Or just a close-up of a scar that would make you think about, what does this mean? What was the history behind this kind of scar? And she's breaking down the body into its constituent elements, into the parts of the body here. And there's male bodies as well, so scars that you see here are just a breast or part of male bodies. But they're not eroticized bodies, not in the same way. They're bodies that feel, they're feeling bodies, material bodies. And that's why this series is called Touch, because it's trying to give you the tactility of what it is like. And she has parts of male bodies here. And I particularly like this image of just the nail. She said that you can really see the character of a person in their nails. Because you see, if you think about somebody biting their nails, it's where the anxiety resides. It's the place where anxiety plays out. You can also tell the class of a person, because workers have very different hands and you see their calluses, and you see usually they have still the grimy residue of work. So there's so much you can see at the very ends of people's bodies. And now we can become very self-conscious about our bodies. And this series that I showed last time, it's this series that she did about her mother who also died. and all of the objects that she published in this book called Mothers, including her lipstick, which is I don't have an image of it, but it was in the other one. Her girdle, her undergarments, very, very, very personal. Yet everything it's intimate and biographical, and everything is used. So it has that feeling of having the history of the person is gone, but the history of their things. So it does tie back to Kubota Shigeko's lament for her own father. So the last artist we'll talk about, and I hope some of you will be writing on her, is Mori Mariko. And she comes out of a world of pop culture that I think resonates with Murakami. She's started out in the world of cosplay and making images that play on cosplay, and everyone knows that cosplay is this idea of costuming, wearing costumes of your favorite anime characters or dressing up in goth outfits to mirror your favorite rock bands, and all different kinds of costume play, which are very serious. They have major conventions of cosplay, and people really enjoy this fantasy world. They want to dress up and insert themselves into this popular culture. Mori is a very successful filmmaker, video artist, performance artist, sculptor, and installation artist. She studied fashion, and she was a model, so she's quite beautiful, and her beauty is part of her medium that she uses. She's also part of the Mori family. If you go to Tokyo, you cannot avoid Moribiru 1, Moribiru 2, Moribiru 3. They are one of the largest real estate developers in the Kansai, in the Kanto area. So she's from a very wealthy, well-connected, the Mori Museum as well, the Mori Art Museum. That's her family. So she lived a very privileged life. She also studied curating, went to the independent study program at the Whitney Museum, studied in Chelsea, College of Art. She's very international and global, and as is the Mori family in general. So this idea of cosplay or costume play, cosplay, were particularly related to adolescents and adolescent male fantasies, to see female figures like dressed up in these metallic outfits. And so she has this, one of her earliest images, Play With Me, is kind of like, she's posing as a anime character, and she's situated herself in some place like Akihabara, the electric town where you can buy all the video games. So she's basically trying to enact this fantasy world, to bring forward this fantasy world that all of these particularly male gamers engage in. Well, she's saying, well, here I am, I'll play with you in reality. So she's brought to life some of those, and of course all of those figures, they have wild blue hair, and they're very busty, and they have these metallic armatures that they wear. They're very surreal. Or she does these photographs of herself dressed in these fantasy outfits riding the subway. So this is a big contrast to the kind of subway images that Seto does. And and when you see her with these various elements on you, you automatically think of kind of cyborgian elements where women or characters in anime are often part machine. And there's a lot about the cyborg, the Donna Haraway discussion of cyborgs as hybrid organisms in this new world of fantasy. I'll do talk for about 10 more minutes. She's also picking up on and making fun of, this is called the tea ceremony. And it's not the tea ceremony that you would think of when you're serving green tea to illustrious guests, but it's actually the tea ceremony of the office lady, who is responsible for doing that kind of labor. But here she's made herself strange. She's always rendering herself strange, even in familiar environments. So here she is serving tea, but she's got these silver tights on and this kind of little elfin hat, this little elfin cap with surreal ears, and she's saying, "Dozo, you know, have some tea. Would you like some tea?" And she's being very demure. So, commenting on the irony of this gesture and the superficiality of it, and also back to what Yanagi was talking about what women's opportunities really are. Because here she has this kind of blank, subservient type of demeanor. So she's really highlighting that aspect, and she's very oblivious to the people who are like, "Oh, so," because it's sort of the way that the elevator girls are. She did this photograph of herself, Birth of a Star, where she's been described as a cyber Lolita, a cyber nymphette. And there's a whole slew of very cute pop singers in Japan who are enormous megastars and become fashion icons. So and this actually comes with music. When you click on it, it had a constant stream. If this is actually an image that she made on a light box, so it's a photograph that's on an advertising light box that you would see in a subway, and it would have a sound, and it just had this kind of ethereal little voice, with her singing in the background, not particularly well, but so you could see that, and of course she's got her foot out. She looks very cute. It's that kind of cuteness aspect. But then she really transmogrifies herself into this new Buddhist icon, a shamaness. And I put this term there. This is the work Nirvana. She did several video installations, including Kumano. So she starts to blend the world of fantasy and the future with these kind of spiritual shamaness images where she's flying through, and of course she's got these tiny little manga anime-like figures floating around her. This idea of liberation from earthly existence, and she herself is something like a bodhisattva, some kind of enlightened being, and she holds her hand out, and I don't think this is actually done ironically. This is actually done in a much more serious way, of kind of a window to a new kind of techno-anime spiritualism, because I think they're very serious. She goes on to do several other works where she's now a futurist shamanist, where she's carrying this magical orb, and she goes to these very futuristic spaces. This is the Kansai International Airport, and she goes there, and she kind of this departures to another world where she's moving through. It's almost like a spaceship. So she's morphed herself into an Eastern goddess of the future, very ultra-modern. And she also has these pictures. Of course, she makes herself look supernatural through the contact lenses, where she has these magical orbs. They often have haunting songs in the background. And one can certainly see these as a kind of re-inscribing of a more exoticized Orientalism, which she's participating in. She's gone another direction since here, where she has this interesting piece. I think she did one, maybe it wasn't at Venice, but she had this, it's called Wave UFO, where each person sits in there and it maps your brain waves. And then you go into this kind of, it's almost like being in a submersion tank, where you start to go into this kind of transcendental state. So I'll leave off with Mori, and some of you will hopefully teach me a little bit about her as well, what she's been doing, because she's continuing to do some very big installation work. She's had major retrospectives, but I'll open the floor up for any questions if you have any.
Would you say that she's equally successful in Japan as she is in the States?
She has. In fact, she's one of the few artists, I think she may have even been under 40 at the time, who had a major retrospective at the Tokyo Gendai Bujutsukan. And there was a lot of controversy about it, because people said the Mori family contributed to that show, and that's why they think that she has received an undue amount of privilege and access considering her youth. But she has been very effective. She has a huge studio in Italy that makes all of her fiberglass UFO things. So she's got a big money-making endeavor that's been very successful all over, including Japan. But there's a lot of grousing about her prominence in Japan. She hasn't earned it yet.
Is she part of that group of artists who basically were supported in Japan after they succeeded in the West? Because she had several big exhibitions, like in Brooklyn and elsewhere in the States, right?
I think primarily it was a boomerang where she did get most of her celebrity outside Japan and then received it. But it was uncharacteristic for a museum like the Gendai Bijutsukan to do a major retrospective of such a young artist. Because I don't think even Murakami had anything like that.
When was that?
About, I need to say 2000, this would be a guess. I'm guessing because I know I saw it and it had the Dream Temple it was called the Dream Temple, and that was, I think, at 01 or 02, could it be?
Okay.
Yeah, I think 01 or 02, but I could double check that.
Oh, no, that's okay. Just a remark, I was given a book yesterday on the 100 most famous women artists or something, a selection. Not a single Japanese woman artist was included.
Really? Who produced it?
Prestel Verlag, a German publisher, but I don't think it's restricted to a German publishing arena, but it shows.
I wonder if there were, who was included that was non-European or non-American?
Well, Abramovich, some Russian artists. Well, I can show you, but wow.
Well, it's all about who's writing and the position of who's doing that. But that would seem to me to be a tremendous oversight because even in the domestic aside, even in the international sphere, Japanese artists, particularly Japanese women artists, have been recognized as being very instrumental to core developments in international modernism and avant-garde. So.
Do you know if Marie Curie does her own pictures? Because when she's the subject of the pictures, does she actually engage a photographer? And then again, how much is it her idea and she poses and all the rest is done by other artists?
She definitely has assistants because she has, some of her works are very technically involved. And the larger installation, she has a whole team of people who are building things for her. But she's a little bit like Cindy Sherman, where she's staging them and then perhaps either releasing them by Shutter or having someone release them, but she's checking them through the digital display. So I consider her the photographer as well, the subject and the photographer. And that's been a very prevalent mode of women's artistic production, is to photograph themselves doing things, and Cindy Sherman's, without a doubt, one of the most successful at it, most enduring.
How would you say the critics differ, for example, when Araki would do these same pictures? Because she's self-positioning her.
Well, I'll throw that back to you. What do you think? Do you think that...
I think that any critique that would be given on an external photographer dies, which is sometimes would even think is a bit unfair if the subject sexualizes itself. It's they free themselves of the context. But if an external photographer would do the same, and the subject, as you said, the Araki says they are freed in their sexuality, everybody else says, well, they're stupid.
Right.
And that I think is a bit problematic. That just because a photographer is a male, it is seen as a kind of visual assault on the object. And here, if she's visually assaulting herself, although these examples were not particularly sexual,
as explicit as they were sexualized, but they're not as explicit.
That she's not using this herself, but that she's doing it to critique.
Well, there's a fine line between being objectified and forming a critique, and it's all in the however you intend something, the reception may be otherwise. This whole discussion surfaced around Madonna and her whole sex campaign that she did, which was very highly sexualized and explicit, and objectified herself. And she said, "Well, I'm doing it, so I'm the constructor of the gaze, and therefore it's not exploitative." And other people said no. And so the feminist camps divided on that. You get the Camille Paglias kind of this way, and the rest, everybody else went the other way. So I don't think there's any unified answer to that question. But you're right, you can't assume that the gaze is always violent just because it's made by a male photographer.
I have a question or comments on the Kubota's work called My Father.
Yes.
Are you, do you know the work by Linda Montano? Also think it's called Father.
I don't.
Okay, it's, I think she's not very famous.
Linda
Montano.
Okay.
She started, I think, 2002, and it's still running as long-time performance. And it's called either My Father or Just Father, and it's an act of caretaking of her own father after he had a stroke, and it's really very personal as well, and I think it's really parallels with the Kubota's work, which is really interesting.
And later on in 2001 or 2, Kubota did one where she's taking care of Nam June Paik. He has had a stroke, and she's taking care of her husband, and all of the ambivalences she has about him come up, which is really interesting, and his own philandering, I guess, and there's kind of about his masculine identity where he becomes someone who needs help, and he's infantilized around her. So I think it may be if you look broadly, that there are ways that women are doing those kinds of works, and it's a common area. So yes.
I have a very broad and unarty question, because Marie, she herself is Japanese, and she's using these Japanese modern iconographies and how she's perceived by the West. But when you see, for example, Lady Gaga, who uses these same systems, but she is Western, and she's always seen as American, and she's actually seen as a new kind of Madonna. How would you say that she's seen by the West, by Japanese viewers, and how different is that she's an American and she's using these same systems, but she's not reattached to a Japanese focus?
Well, in pop art, in pop culture, anything goes. You can do anything you want if you can get away with it. And I think part of the thing, I think people think she's completely campy and out there and costuming herself to create a performative identity. And I don't think anyone that I've known, I haven't read much Lady Gaga critique myself, but that anyone thinks of her as taking a critical stand towards anything. That it's anything but being campy and being dressed up. And of course her singing is so theatrical to begin with. She's really creating a whole theatrical environment around her own kind of singing to stand out as a persona in that sphere. But do you mean in terms of creating any kind of East-West identity? Because I don't see her doing much kind of, this is not something she's not transposing herself racially or ethnically in any way.
No, but she's using a lot of stuff from Japanese culture. I think even her stylist is Japanese.
Oh, right.
She's using this fetishization a lot. And I think she has a cultural identity thing with her biggest fans being the Japanese.
I see. Well, at this point, that kind of anime culture is what they call the gross national cool of Japan. So I think everybody feels, as global consumers in this mass media sphere, they can participate in that. So she's working, and it's cool. It's just a kind of cool pop culture sphere that she's tapping into. And but I don't think she's trying to transform herself racially. But really, like you said, she's capitalizing on this popular sphere, this really hip, chic, popular sphere of Harajuku lovers type.
I actually think that she's trying to erase herself in ethnicity and not even in sexual terms. She's sometimes very androgynous. But you're right, it's seen totally different just from the aspect that she's a pop performer and Mercury is a pop-like artist.
Right. No, there's no, it's not expected that there will be any subtext to what she's doing. Surface is fine in pop sphere, whereas Mori is really trying to put an interpretive gloss on top of what those performative activities, and it's a big difference. Well, thank you all. It's great. Did you
yeah, I have many more questions, but I don't want to pose them all now. But the selection of artists you made today, I mean, you started out by choosing some that were mostly active in the US, right, but Japanese nationals. Was that because you feel that right after the post-war there weren't that many Japanese artists working in Japan? Or is it because you feel they are sufficiently Japanese to include them in this survey class on Japanese contemporary visual culture? Or,
both.
And how do you think the whole scene on women, gender, sexuality has evolved over the past 50 years that you covered?
Well, I already did cover some of the artists who were working in Japan, like Tanaka Atsuko, who's part of Gutai. So she could easily be included here, but because she fit nicely within the larger sphere of Gutai, I think that was important. And then Kusama, of course, going back and forth quite extensively. But I do honestly believe that for this generation, for the generation of the 60s, it was much easier to work outside Japan, and they had much more opportunities. And it still wasn't easy. It's not like we didn't have plenty of misogynistic culture still in the United States, but it wasn't compared to Japan. There just was so little opportunity. So that's, I think, focusing on the Japanese participation in these international spheres like Fluxus or some of the group give you a sense of how people are participating and how it's kind of a fluid world, but they're not divesting themselves of identity. And Yoko Ono was consistently identified with Japan. She came from a very prominent Japanese family. She was classically trained as a pianist, I believe. Her family that family is the Yasuda Zaibatsu family, so she's had several very high-placed politicians. So I think that was also important. Kubota, I mean, one could say the same thing about Namjoon Paik too, because he was in Japan before he came to New York, and in Germany, and so there's lots of things floating around. I do think that the generation of artists, the next generation of artists working in Japan became much more important, and also working on particular social issues that relate to Japanese women and Japanese gendered constructions and Japanese historical memory become really important. Shimada being a great example of that, but Mori as well, because the whole pop culture thing she's dealing with, cosplay, is generating out of Japan, even though she's getting a lot of play other places. So I think it's become so much easier, and now that the whole world of photography, snapshot photography, has become a world of creative expression, and girls' social networks can be represented. There's a lot more opportunity. It's much more democratized, I think. But good question.
Just with the social sphere, there's always the talk about interracial kids being neither here nor there. And Yoko Ono, for me, being an American, but obviously being for the Americans an Asian, is she seen by the Japanese as still Yoko Ono? Just because she's the most famous example that I know who's actually Japanese, but who's considered being American.
Right. And I think she is a naturalized American citizen. As was John Lennon, which is funny because you don't think of him as having taken on a new national identity because he's British. But of course it is a different culture and a different national identity.
But is she still seen as Japanese by the Japanese, or is she shift apart?
She is, and sometimes the Japanese talk about this. This is a generalization, but they say, well, here she's Yoko Ono, but there she's Ono Yoko, and that's a difference. There's different people. They're almost different people. There's the celebrity, there's the international figure, and then there's the person who's really well known, not only as a celebrity, but also within the context of her own family history, which is quite considerable. As I said, she came from a very powerful family. Issei Miyake says the same thing. He says there's the brand, there's the persona of Issei Miyake, and then there's Miyake Issei, who's a private person who's in Japan and has a different identity, and so they kind of see that. They see themselves in this multifaceted world. So, but of course Miyake has lived in Japan and worked mostly out of Japan, even though he's a multinational company. Yoko Ono has lived outside Japan most of her life. She did have some major retrospectives.
Thank you.